My name is Olivia, 34 years old, and until recently I played the quiet, accommodating wife. It was exactly midnight when the heavy front door of our Connecticut home rattled with loud knocking. When I opened it, my husband's 20-year-old daughter, Brittany, pushed right past me. She was dragging two massive suitcases, her boyfriend Zack trailing right behind her, tracking mud onto the hardwood floors. "Dad said we are moving in," she announced, not as a request, but as a royal decree. Before I could process the intrusion, she shoved a crisp piece of paper directly against my chest. It was a printed list. Breakfast at 7 a.m. sharp. No greasy food, fresh sheets every week. Clean our bathroom every single night. Hand wash our work clothes. Iron them. Hang them. Never fold them. I waited for a punchline that never came. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to smile through disrespect, while quietly preparing to completely destroy a toxic person's fragile ego. Heavy footsteps drew my attention to the grand staircase. My husband Bradley came walking down, yawning loudly, as if this midnight home invasion was just another mundane household event. He is a 42-year-old regional sales director who wears his mid-level corporate title like a crown. He hugged Brittany warmly. I held up the printed piece of paper expecting him to snatch it away and scold his daughter for treating his wife like a hired servant. Instead, Bradley let out an exasperated sigh and looked at me with an expression of profound irritation. "Come on, Olivia," he said, his voice dripping with that familiar, condescending tone he always used to remind me of my place. "Be a team player. The kids need a place to stay. Your little staging gig barely pays for your own groceries anyway, so you have plenty of free time to help out around here." I stood absolutely still in the foyer, the cool night air drifting in through the open doorway. I looked at Bradley taking in his arrogant posture, and then I looked at Brittany, who was smirking at me with an unmistakable look of triumph. I did not scream. I did not cry. I did not throw the bags out onto the lawn. I simply smiled a calm, pleasant smile, folded the list of chores, and slipped it into the pocket of my robe. "Okay," I said, my voice smooth and perfectly agreeable. What Bradley did not know, what he could never possibly comprehend in his narrow worldview, was the actual reality of our financial dynamic. He genuinely believed that my home staging business was just some pathetic little decorating hobby that kept me busy while he went out and conquered the corporate world. He loved to boast at dinner parties about how he was the sole provider, the king of the castle, the man who carried the heavy burden of supporting a family. He honestly believed he was paying $6,000 a month in rent to some elite anonymous corporate landlord. The truth was far more entertaining. That anonymous corporate landlord was Apex Holdings, LLC, a real estate investment firm that I owned entirely. I bought this luxury suburban mansion in cash 5 years ago, long before Bradley and I ever met. He was paying rent directly into my high-yield savings account. Furthermore, his arrogant remark about paying for my groceries completely ignored the fact that just last year, when his reckless spending habits nearly tanked his credit score, I quietly paid off the remaining balance on his luxury sports car, using funds from one of my commercial property flips. I let him believe it was an accounting error from his bank. I let him maintain his illusion of grandeur because it was easier than fighting his chronic narcissism. But standing in that hallway holding a list of chores from an entitled college dropout, I realized the illusion had finally run its course. Zack, a trust fund baby, whose wealthy parents had recently cut off his allowance for refusing to finish his degree, tossed his keys onto the console table. "We are going to need the Wi-Fi password," he demanded, not even bothering to look me in the eye. "And make sure the hot water is on. I need a shower before bed." Bradley patted Zack on the back. "Make yourselves at home, kids," he declared grandly. "I pay the rent for this place, so you have every right to be here." I watched them march upstairs, taking over my space, leaving me alone in the quiet foyer. I walked slowly into the kitchen countertops, gleaming under the pendant lights. I pulled my phone from my pocket, opened my messages, and found the contact for my sister-in-law, Kendra. Kendra is a brilliant corporate attorney who also happens to be the only person who knows my true financial status. I typed out a simple message: start the 30-day clock, prepare the documents. I hit send, placed the phone down on the counter, and went to sleep with a profound sense of anticipation. Morning arrived with crisp suburban silence. The clock in the hallway chimed exactly 7 times. According to Brittany's schedule, breakfast was required at 7 a.m. sharp. I stood in the kitchen humming a cheerful tune as I heard heavy footsteps stomping down the stairs. Brittany marched into the dining room, Zack trailing behind her, both looking expectant and hungry. They took their seats at the table. I walked over with a silver serving tray, a polite, accommodating smile resting on my face. I placed the tray gently in the center of the table. Brittany looked down. Sitting perfectly in the center of a fine china plate was a single piece of bread burnt completely black, accompanied by a tall glass of tap water. Brittany stared at the blackened square of bread sitting on the fine china. Her perfectly manicured fingers gripped the edge of the dining table so tightly, her knuckles turned white. Zack rubbed his eyes, looking back and forth between the plate and me, clearly struggling to comprehend the situation. For a long moment, the only sound in the kitchen was the hum of the stainless steel refrigerator. "Is this some kind of sick joke?" Brittany finally hissed, her voice trembling with indignation. I kept my posture relaxed and offered a polite, serene smile. "Not at all, Brittany. I followed your printed schedule to the letter. Breakfast at 7 in the morning sharp. I made absolutely certain there was zero grease used in the preparation. I hope it is to your liking." She shoved the chair back violently. The wooden legs screeched against the custom hardwood floor. "You think you are so clever," she shouted. "You are nothing but a desperate housewife playing interior designer. I am not eating this trash." I did not flinch or raise my voice. I simply turned my back to her and walked over to the kitchen island. Spread across the massive quartz countertop were my architectural blueprints. These were not casual sketches. They were highly detailed hand-rendered layouts for a $5 million commercial staging contract I had secured the previous afternoon. The project required precise spatial planning for a luxury boutique hotel lobby, and I had spent the last 3 nights refining every single measurement. Brittany stomped over to the island, furious that I had dismissed her tantrum so easily. She noticed where my attention was directed. She looked at the intricate blueprints, then looked at the tall glass of tap water I had poured for her. Without breaking eye contact with me, she reached out and wrapped her hand around the glass. "Oops," she said in a flat, monotone voice. She forcefully swiped her arm sideways. The heavy glass tipped over, sending a tidal wave of water rushing directly across the quartz surface. I watched as the water immediately saturated the thick drafting paper. The black ink bled and warped into an unrecognizable gray blur. Dozens of hours of meticulous, irreplaceable work dissolved right in front of my eyes. "My hand slipped," Brittany said, a malicious smirk spreading across her face. "Maybe next time you will take my breakfast requests a little more seriously." "What is going on in here?" a loud, irritated voice demanded from the hallway. Bradley marched into the kitchen, violently adjusting the knot of his expensive silk tie. He looked at the chaos. He saw his 20-year-old daughter pretending to look distressed, Zack hovering awkwardly in the background, and me standing quietly over a puddle of ruined documents. "Your wife is bullying us," Brittany whined immediately, her voice pitching up an octave to sound like a helpless child. "She gave us literal garbage to eat and then started screaming at me when I accidentally spilled my water." I looked at my husband, expecting a shred of common sense or basic observation to kick in. "Bradley, she intentionally flooded my staging blueprints. This is the layout for a $5 million commercial property contract. The entire presentation is ruined." Bradley let out a long, exaggerated sigh. He walked over, glanced at the soggy, destroyed paper, and rolled his eyes. He rubbed his temples as if I was the one giving him a massive headache. "For heaven's sake, Olivia, just print your little drawings again," he snapped. "Do you have to make a federal case out of everything? Stop overreacting and stop making my daughter cry before I even have my morning coffee." He completely ignored the fact that these were hand-drafted technical plans treating my highly lucrative career like a child coloring book. He turned his attention entirely to Brittany, his expression softening into an indulgent, sickeningly sweet smile. He reached into the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a designer leather wallet. He extracted a crisp $100 bill and pressed it into his daughter-waiting hand. "Go take Zack out to that fancy brunch spot downtown," Bradley told her, patting her shoulder affectionately. "Do not let her ruin your morning. It is a good thing I am the only one bringing real money into this house so we can afford to deal with these little inconveniences." Brittany snatched the bill, shooting me a triumphant glare over his shoulder. "Thanks, Dad," she chirped happily. "You are the best." Zack eagerly followed her toward the front door, already checking his phone for restaurant menus. Bradley grabbed his leather briefcase from the counter, not even bothering to look at me or the mess on the island. He walked out the door, his chest puffed out, fully convinced he had just masterfully handled a petty domestic squabble like the benevolent king of his castle. The heavy oak door clicked shut. The house plunged back into total silence. I stood alone in the kitchen. I did not shed a single tear. I did not shout in frustration. I felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over my entire body. I grabbed a roll of paper towels and methodically began to soak up the standing water. I carefully gathered the ruined, soggy blueprints, folding the destroyed paper onto itself. I walked over to the stainless steel trash bin, pressed the foot pedal, and dropped the ruined project inside. I washed my hands, dried them completely, and reached into my pocket to retrieve my secondary business phone. I opened the messaging application and scrolled down to my secure chat with Kendra. I tapped the screen with steady, deliberate keystrokes. I did not include any emotional venting or complaints about the morning. I typed the exact command we had previously agreed upon for this exact scenario. Start the 30-day clock, prepare the documents. I pressed the send button. The delivery confirmation pinged instantly on my screen. By day 3, the tension in the house had thickened. I was at the master bedroom desk trying to reconstruct the commercial blueprints Brittany had so casually destroyed. The bedroom door was open a crack, allowing sounds from the hallway to filter in. Zack was whining. He was complaining to Bradley that the mattress in the guest room was too firm. It was allegedly causing him severe lower back pain, making a decent night of sleep impossible. He claimed his wealthy parents would be utterly appalled if they knew he was sleeping on such substandard furniture. I did not even look up from my laptop when the heavy master bedroom door flew open, hitting the wall with a loud thud. Bradley marched inside, his face flushed with that familiar, arrogant red hue. He did not ask how my work was going or apologize for the interruption. He marched straight past my desk and headed directly for my mahogany dresser. Without warning, he pulled the top drawer open, grabbed my neatly folded sweaters, and threw them over his shoulder. They landed in a messy pile out in the hallway. "Bradley, what exactly are you doing?" I asked, my voice remaining perfectly level. He grabbed another handful of my clothes and tossed them toward the door. "We are making a change," he announced, breathing heavily as he ransacked my closet. "Brittany and Zack are taking the master suite starting right now. You need to clear your stuff out of here and move down to the den." I closed my laptop and folded my hands. "You want me to move into the downstairs den?" I repeated carefully. "The den is the size of a closet, Bradley. It barely fits a twin bed and has no proper heating." Bradley turned around to face me, his hands resting on his hips in a stance of absolute defiance. "Zack comes from a very prominent family, Olivia. His mother is practically royalty in her country club circle. If they drop by and see their son sleeping in a standard guest room, they will think we are struggling. We need to project wealth. You are going to take the den because you do not need a massive suite just to play around with your little decorating hobby." He grabbed my silk blouse off a hanger and tossed it onto the growing pile in the hallway. Brittany stood just outside the door, her arms crossed over her chest, smiling down at my clothes on the floor. Zack was leaning against the wall behind her, looking entirely pleased with himself. I stood up from my desk. I looked at the master suite with its vaulted ceilings, the custom walk-in closet I had designed myself, and the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the landscaped backyard. Then I looked at Bradley, who was puffing out his chest, trying to look intimidating. "This is my bedroom, Bradley," I said, maintaining my calm demeanor. "We are husband and wife. You are telling your wife to sleep in a glorified storage closet so your adult daughter and her unemployed boyfriend can sleep in a king-sized bed." Bradley scoffed, taking a step toward me to use his height as an advantage. "Let us get one thing straight, Olivia. I am the one who pays the $6,000 a month rent to the corporate landlord who owns this property. My money pays the lease, so my rules dictate who sleeps where. If you have a problem with the living arrangements, you can pack your bags and find somewhere else to do your little craft projects." The irony of his statement was almost too delicious to bear. He was standing in a house I owned outright, threatening to evict me from my own bedroom, using the rent money he paid directly into my personal investment accounts. He was so blinded by his own ego that he could not see the trap closing around him. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice or shed a single tear of frustration. I simply offered him a polite, understanding nod. "You make a very compelling point, Bradley," I said smoothly. "You do pay the rent. I will pack my things immediately." Brittany let out a loud laugh from the hallway. "That is what I thought," she sneered. "Hurry up and get your junk out of here. Zack needs to lie down." I spent the next hour moving my belongings downstairs. I was careful to carry my heavy steel lockbox myself, ensuring Bradley never got a chance to see what was inside. It held the original property deed, alongside the ironclad prenuptial agreement he had signed without reading 5 years ago. I set up my makeshift workspace in the cramped, chilly den. It was uncomfortable, but the discomfort was temporary. Every move they made was just adding more fuel to the fire I was preparing to ignite. Upstairs, I could hear Bradley trying to play the role of the generous provider. He was speaking loudly, ensuring his voice carried all the way down the stairs to where I was sitting. "Do not worry about the old mattress," Zack, my husband, projected grandly. "You kids deserve the best. I am ordering you a brand new $5,000 orthopedic mattress right now." I sat down and opened my banking application. He used our shared joint account for his extravagant purchases. He conveniently forgot the primary account holder was me. Up in the master bedroom, Bradley opened his laptop. I heard him confidently reading out the credit card numbers, boasting about the premium delivery service. He hit the checkout button, ready to cement his status as the ultimate provider. Downstairs, I watched the authorization request pop up on my screen. I calmly pressed a single red button on my banking app. Upstairs, the boastful chatter suddenly stopped dead. I heard Bradley furiously clicking his mouse. The screen in front of him flashed a bright red error message. Transaction declined. "Olivia!" The roar echoed down the grand staircase, shaking the walls of the hallway. Frantic footsteps pounded against the oak treads. Bradley burst into the downstairs den, his face a dangerous shade of crimson. He was waving his silver laptop in the air like a weapon. "What did you do to our checking account?" he demanded, spit flying from his lips. "I just tried to buy my daughter a bed, and my card was declined." "Did you transfer the money to your secret little stash for your fabric swatches and paint samples?" I remained perfectly still in my cramped new workspace. I did not shrink back or raise my voice to match his panic. I smoothly picked up my cell phone from the desk. "I did not touch the money, Bradley." I replied, my tone as even as glass. "I suggest you check the transaction history before you start throwing accusations around this house." He slammed the laptop onto a side table and leaned over me, invading my personal space. "I know you drained it," he hissed. "You are punishing Brittany because you are jealous of the close bond we share. You are trying to embarrass me in front of Zack." I unlocked my phone and opened our joint banking application. I turned the bright screen toward him. I let the cold, hard numbers do the talking. "Read it," I instructed softly. Bradley blinked, his eyes darting across the screen. The balance sat at a dismal $14.22. Just below that, the recent transactions told the undeniable story. Yesterday morning at 9, an auto draft of $1,800 cleared for his luxury sports car lease. 2 hours later, another auto draft of $2,200 was pulled directly by his exclusive suburban country club for his quarterly dues and his extensive bar tab. He stared at the screen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He had forgotten what day of the month it was. His obsession with looking like a wealthy executive to his golf buddies had bankrupted his daily spending account. "Those are automatic payments," he stammered, trying to pivot the blame back onto my shoulders. "You are the one who is supposed to manage the household budget. If you had a real career, I would not have to carry this entire family on my back. I am out there killing myself to provide this lavish lifestyle while you play around with throw pillows. If you contributed any wealth to this marriage, a simple mattress purchase would not be a crisis." I let his delusion hang in the air. He was standing in a multi-million-dollar property I owned outright, yelling at me about carrying the family. The sheer audacity was almost poetic. "Dad, is everything okay upstairs?" Brittany called out from the second-floor landing, her voice dripping with fake concern. "Zack wants to know when the delivery guys are coming." Bradley panicked. His entire identity rested on Zack believing he was a powerful titan of industry. He could not possibly admit to this entitled 22-year-old that his bank account was overdrawn. "Coming right up," Sweetie Bradley shouted back, his voice cracking under the immense pressure of his own massive ego. "Just a minor fraud alert block on the card. You know how these premium platinum cards are? They are overly cautious with large, unexpected purchases." He snatched his laptop and retreated to the living room, pacing back and forth like a caged animal. I watched him from the doorway of the den. He sank into the leather sofa, his hands shaking as he frantically typed on the keyboard. He was logging into his corporate employee portal. He was accessing his retirement account. He was totally desperate. He needed liquidity immediately to save face. I watched him click through the serious warning screens. The portal clearly stated that an early hardship withdrawal would incur a massive 20% penalty plus heavy income taxes. He was throwing away decades of his own future financial security just to buy a piece of furniture for a girl who flatly refused to get a job. He hesitated for only a fraction of a second before hitting the confirm button. He willingly traded his retirement for his pride. 10 minutes later, Bradley marched back to the base of the stairs, his chest puffed out once again. "The order is officially placed," he announced loudly, ensuring his voice carried all the way up to the master suite. "Expedited shipping. It will be here by tomorrow afternoon. Only the absolute best for my family." He grabbed his briefcase and shot me a disgusted glare. "I have to go to the office and do the real work," he muttered aggressively, adjusting his expensive watch. "Try to make yourself useful today, Olivia. Maybe clean the guest bathroom. It smells dusty." I watched him walk out the front door, climbing into the luxury car I had secretly paid off. He sped down the driveway, the engine roaring loudly, a desperate man pretending he had the world on a string. The house fell completely silent again. I went back to my laptop in the cramped den, shifting my focus from ruined blueprints to my legal preparations. The 30-day clock was ticking, and I had zero intention of letting a single second go to waste. Around noon, the heavy oak front door swung open. Bradley had forgotten to lock the deadbolt in his rush to flee the reality of his bank account. High heels clicked sharply against the hardwood floor. I stepped out of the den and smiled broadly. Kendra, my sister-in-law, had arrived unannounced. She was dressed in a sharp-tailored designer blazer exuding an aura of absolute corporate authority. She walked down the hallway completely unbothered, stopping only to deliberately step right over Bradley custom golf clubs that he had carelessly dumped on the floor the night before. She did not even look down at them. She strode directly into the kitchen and stopped at the large quartz island. With a swift, decisive motion, she raised her hand and dropped a thick, heavy legal folder right onto the countertop. The heavy legal folder landed on the quartz countertop with a resounding smack, echoing through the cavernous kitchen. Kendra did not miss a single beat. She smoothly slid onto one of the leather bar stools, crossing her long legs and adjusting the lapel of her tailored crimson blazer. As my sister-in-law and a ruthless corporate attorney, she possessed an intimidating presence that commanded absolute respect in any room she entered. Her dark eyes sparkled with a predatory gleam as she looked at me, her perfectly arched eyebrows raising in silent anticipation. She tapped her manicured fingernail against the cover. I stepped out of the cramped downstairs den and walked over to the kitchen island, taking my place across from her. I had spent the last hour moving my belongings into that glorified closet, pretending to be the subservient, defeated wife Bradley demanded. Kendra unclasped the folder and spread the crisp documents across the smooth stone surface, pushing aside a lingering drop of water from Brittany's earlier tantrum. Everything is prepared and executed precisely to your specifications. Kendra announced, her voice a low melodic hum of pure competence. The 30-day eviction notice is fully drafted and ready right now. But honestly, Olivia, the lease agreement you had me construct 5 years ago is a masterpiece of legal entrapment, she added smoothly. She slid a stapled packet of papers toward me. It was the original residential lease agreement between Bradley and Apex Holdings, LLC. I looked down at the signature line. Bradley had scribbled his name with his usual messy flourish, completely oblivious to the fact that his new bride was the sole proprietor of the anonymous corporate entity he was renting from every single month. Kendra leaned forward, resting her elbows on the counter. A quiet laugh rumbled outward. You bought this sprawling Connecticut mansion in pure cash 2 years before you even met him, she said, shaking her head in sheer amusement. The fact that he actually walks around this property puffing out his chest and thinking he is the absolute king of a castle he is secretly renting from his own wife is the best reality television I have ever witnessed. It is almost a shame we have to end the broadcast. He brought this entirely upon himself, I replied softly, tracing my finger over his signature. He just evicted me from my own master bedroom suite. He did it so his college dropout daughter and her unemployed boyfriend could sleep comfortably, I continued. He explicitly told me that his rent money dictates the rules of the house. Kendra let out a sharp, genuine laugh. Well, then we should absolutely let the lease dictate the rules. She flipped to the 4th page of the document and tapped a specific highlighted paragraph. Look right here at Section 12, Paragraph C. You specifically instructed me to bake this penalty clause into the fine print when we originally set up the LLC. I leaned in to read the printed text. It was the unauthorized long-term guest clause. The stipulation was crystal clear. Any guest residing on the premises for more than 48 hours, without explicit written consent from the corporate landlord, would trigger an immediate financial penalty. Not just a warning, Kendra continued, her eyes tracing the legal jargon. An automatic fine of $500 per day per unauthorized occupant, plus it acts as a direct violation of the core lease agreement, triggering an immediate default. Bradley just moved 2 unauthorized adult occupants into the primary suite. That is $1,000 a day in strict penalties. And since he just drained his entire checking account paying for his luxury car lease and his ridiculous country club dues, he has absolutely zero liquid capital to cover these daily fines. I added, keeping my voice low and steady. He even tried to buy them a $5,000 mattress this morning. When the transaction declined, he panicked and initiated an early hardship withdrawal from his corporate retirement account. Kendra's eyes widened in genuine shock before narrowing into a lethal, satisfied squint. He raided his own retirement fund to buy a bed for his grown entitled daughter, she asked. Do you realize the massive tax penalties he is going to face for an early unsecured withdrawal? She continued incredulously. He is financially setting himself on fire just to keep up appearances for a trust fund kid who does not even respect him. He told me that if I had a real career, he would not have to carry this entire family on his back, I stated simply. He genuinely believes my home staging business is just a pathetic little hobby. He has absolutely no idea that my commercial property flips funded this house and his luxury sports car entirely. Kendra shook her head slowly, collecting the papers and tapping them into a neat stack. You protected his fragile ego for far too long, Olivia. He mistook your grace for weakness. Now he is about to face a corporate landlord who does not care about his mid-level sales title or his golf handicap. Apex Holdings, LLC, is about to drop the hammer. We will serve the default notice on Friday afternoon. That gives his daily penalties enough time to compound into a staggering sum. I nodded in agreement, feeling the heavy weight of the past 5 years finally lift. Before we could finalize the delivery logistics, a loud, obnoxious yawn echoed from the grand staircase. Heavy, shuffling footsteps descended the oak treads. Brittany appeared in the kitchen archway wearing expensive silk pajamas. She stretched her arms above her head, acting like she owned the very air she was breathing. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw us standing at the island. Brittany's face twisted into an ugly, condescending sneer. "Seriously, Olivia," she snapped. "Who let the hired help in?" Kendra slowly turned around to face her, placing both hands flat on the counter, her eyes narrowing lethally. Kendra did not blink. She simply tilted her head, her dark eyes locking onto Brittany with the chilling precision of a predator observing a dull prey. She let the silence stretch for an agonizing moment, forcing Brittany to shift under her gaze. "You must be Bradley's offspring," Kendra finally said, her voice a smooth, icy velvet. "I can see the striking family resemblance. You share his profound inability to assess the actual power dynamics of a room before opening your mouth." Brittany's face flushed a deep red. She crossed her arms tighter, trying to maintain her arrogant facade. "I do not know who you think you are, but you cannot speak to me like that in my own house. I am going to tell my father to throw you out." Kendra let out a soft chuckle that sounded more like a death knell. She reached into the pocket of her tailored blazer and extracted a crisp, matte black business card with embossed gold lettering. She placed it perfectly flat on the quartz countertop and slid it across the island. "I strongly encourage you to call him," Kendra replied, maintaining absolute eye contact. "Tell him that Kendra Vance, senior partner at Vance and Sterling Corporate Litigation, is standing in the kitchen. Tell him I am evaluating the legal liabilities of unauthorized occupants residing in a corporate-owned property. And while you have him on the phone, perhaps you should ask him why his credit card was just declined for your new mattress." Brittany looked down at the business card. The gold lettering gleamed under the pendant lights. The arrogant sneer vanished from her face, replaced by a sudden wave of panic. She looked back up at Kendra, then over to me, realizing she had walked into a trap. Without uttering another word, she spun on her heel and practically jogged back up the grand staircase. "She is entirely out of her depth," Kendra noted, turning her attention back to the legal documents. "Just like her father. The paperwork is locked in Olivia. Apex Holdings LLC will initiate the default process on Friday. Enjoy the show." Kendra gathered her briefcase, gave me a sharp nod of solidarity, and walked out the front door, leaving the scent of impending doom in her wake. The house remained incredibly tense for the rest of the afternoon. Bradley never returned from the office, likely hiding behind closed doors to figure out how to salvage his ruined finances. Around 4 o'clock, the frantic clicking of high heels echoed down the hallway. Brittany stormed back into the kitchen, clutching her phone to her chest, her face pale with a completely different kind of panic. "Zack's mother just called," Brittany announced, pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. "Penelope wants to see where her son is living. She is demanding we host a massive housewarming and engagement party this coming Saturday. She is inviting all of their country club friends." I leaned against the counter, folding my arms. "That sounds like a significant undertaking for you, Brittany. Planning a party for 50 wealthy guests requires a lot of effort." "I am not planning anything," she snapped, stopping her pacing to glare at me. "You are doing it. My father said you have nothing but free time since your staging business is a joke. You are going to cater the entire event. I need past hors d'oeuvres, a full grazing table, and an open bar." I raised an eyebrow, maintaining my serene composure. "You want me to cater a luxury event for 50 people on 4 days' notice?" Brittany stepped closer, her temporary intimidation by Kendra completely forgotten in the face of her current social emergency. She looked me up and down with utter contempt. "Zack's parents are used to Michelin star food, Olivia. They dine at the finest restaurants in the country. Try not to embarrass us with whatever cheap casserole you usually make. You need to pull out all the stops and make it look like we actually have money." She did not stop there. She leaned in, her voice dropping to a very harsh whisper. "My dad pays for this entire house. He puts the roof over your head. The absolute least you can do is make yourself useful and cook a decent meal for my future in-laws. Do not mess this up, or I will make sure my dad kicks you out on the street." I looked at this entitled, arrogant young woman, completely blind to the reality crashing down around her. She genuinely believed she held all the power, wielding her father's imaginary wealth against the very woman who actually owned the ground she stood on. "Consider it done," I said, offering her a bright, cheerful smile. "I will handle the catering. It will be a night your future in-laws will absolutely never forget." Brittany let out a loud, dramatic sigh of relief. "Finally, you are actually being helpful," she muttered, turning around and heading back toward the master suite to tell Zack the good news. I waited until I heard the heavy bedroom door click shut on the second floor. The smile immediately vanished from my face. I walked straight into the downstairs den and opened my laptop. I did not search for catering menus or grocery lists. Instead, I navigated directly to the encrypted backend portal for Apex Holdings LLC. I logged in with my administrative credentials and opened the active tenant ledger for Bradley Wilson. His account was sitting in the red, flagged for multiple lease violations regarding his unauthorized long-term guests. I clicked on the penalty enforcement tab. The system calculated the exact fines owed under Section 12. I typed in the exact command to execute the financial penalty clause. I initiated an automatic, non-reversible rent penalty withdrawal of exactly $15,000 directly from Bradley's remaining depleted investment accounts. I firmly closed the laptop and smiled brightly as the system finalized his financial ruin. Bradley marched into the den an hour later, completely unaware of the digital guillotine that had just dropped on his finances. He was holding his sleek smartphone, his chest puffed out in that familiar posture of unearned superiority. He had already mentally spent the retirement money he just raided. He tapped the screen with his thumb, navigating to his banking application to secure the deposit for Penelope's ridiculous party demands. I watched him from my desk, my face a mask of absolute calm. The smug satisfaction instantly drained from his face, replaced by a sickly, chalky white pallor. He blinked rapidly, rubbing his eyes as if the digital numbers staring back at him were a mirage. The $15,000 hardship withdrawal from his 401k had posted successfully. But just seconds later, a corresponding autodraft had wiped the account clean. The description simply read, "Apex Holdings, LLC, lease violation penalty." Bradley let out a very sharp, ragged gasp. His knees buckled slightly, forcing him to grip the edge of the leather sofa for physical support. His chest heaved as he began to hyperventilate, the sheer panic overriding his carefully cultivated executive persona. He was staring at absolute zero. The money he had financially set himself on fire to obtain was gone before he could even touch it. He scrambled to open his email, frantically searching for an explanation. He found the automated notice from his landlord sitting in his inbox, outlining the strict penalty for harboring unauthorized long-term guests. The reality of his situation crashed down on him like a concrete block. He had no money for the extravagant engagement party his daughter had just promised her new mother-in-law. He had no money for his country club dues. He had completely and utterly no money for anything. He was totally bankrupt. He practically threw himself onto the sofa, his fingers trembling wildly as he typed a number into his phone. He was calling the generic, toll-free customer service line listed on his lease agreement. He pressed the phone to his ear, his breathing shallow and erratic. From my desk, just 10 feet away, my secondary business cell phone began to vibrate silently. I kept it tucked inside the top drawer out of sight. The screen illuminated the dark wood, displaying an incoming call from Bradley Wilson. I slowly opened the drawer. I looked down at the glowing screen, watching his desperate attempt to reach his faceless corporate landlord. I smoothly reached out and pressed the red decline button. Bradley ripped his phone away from his ear and let out a guttural sound of pure frustration as the call went straight to an automated voicemail system. He dialed once again. I declined it again. He tossed his phone onto the coffee table and buried his face in his hands. He was a man completely broken by his own arrogance. I closed the drawer and turned back to my laptop, my expression perfectly neutral. Bradley slowly lifted his head, his bloodshot eyes locking onto me. The usual condescension was completely gone, replaced by a pathetic, desperate pleading. He stood up on shaky legs and walked over to my desk. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. He needed a lifeline, and he was finally desperate enough to ask the woman he had spent years degrading. "Olivia," he started, his voice cracking pitifully. "I need your help. A massive banking error just wiped out my entire account. The landlord system glitched and pulled a ridiculous penalty fee. I cannot cover the deposits for Brittany's party this weekend. Penelope is expecting a luxury event. If we do not deliver, Zack's family will completely cancel the wedding. They care deeply about social standing. I need cash right now." I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands together in my lap. I did not offer a shred of sympathy. I waited for the inevitable request. Bradley shifted his weight, unable to maintain eye contact. "I need you to call your parents," he mumbled, staring at the floorboards. "Ask them for a short-term loan, just exactly $20,000 to get us through this weekend. I will pay them back with interest as soon as my next commission check clears." I let a cold, hollow laugh escape my lips. The audacity was truly breathtaking. "You want me to ask my parents for money?" I asked, my voice dripping with ice. "You specifically told my brother last Thanksgiving that my family was a bunch of broke losers." You stood in the middle of their modest living room, drinking their wine, and loudly bragged about how you rescued me from a life of coupon clipping and mediocrity. You called my father a financial failure because he drove a sensible sedan instead of a leased sports car. I leaned forward, my gaze piercing straight through his fragile ego. "I do not think those broke losers will lend you a dime, Bradley. You are entirely on your own." He physically recoiled as if I had just struck him directly across the face. The sheer panic in his eyes intensified, mutating into wild, feral desperation. He immediately spun around and sprinted out of the den, frantically grabbing his car keys from the entryway console. He had absolutely zero options left in his respectable corporate world. No reputable bank would issue him a personal loan with his overextended credit profile, and his retirement account was already locked and penalized. I watched through the front window as he peeled out of the driveway in his beloved luxury sports car. He was heading straight for the industrial district on the edge of town. He was driving directly toward a shady, high-interest payday lender that operated out of a rundown strip mall. He was willing to sign away his soul to secure exactly $20,000 in fast cash for Penelope's extravagant party. And to get that immediate liquidity from a predatory lender, Bradley was blindly putting his prized luxury car up as collateral. The kitchen was incredibly busy. I spent 2 days arranging catering for Penelope's event. Towers of artisanal cheeses, perfectly seared tenderloin crostini, and polished crystal flutes lined the court's countertops. I spared no expense utilizing the funds Bradley miraculously secured. He returned Thursday evening looking victorious, clutching an envelope stuffed with $20,000 in high-interest cash. He ignored that a predatory lender installed a permanent GPS tracking device under his luxury coupe. In his warped reality, he saved the family reputation. He swaggered around loudly, taking credit for the lavish spread I procured. He tasted a truffle and nodded in deep satisfaction, completely blind to the trap closing tightly around him. At 4 o'clock, the oak doors swung open. Brittany marched in, trailing the heavy scent of floral perfume. She wore a designer cocktail dress, undoubtedly charged to one of Bradley's soon-to-be defaulted credit cards. She stopped at the island, eyeing the immaculate presentation of Michelin-quality hors d'oeuvres. Surprise flickered across her face, but she quickly masked it with her usual sneer of entitlement. She reached into her shopping tote and violently tossed a crinkling plastic package onto the center island. It landed dangerously close to a silver platter of premium caviar. I looked down at the package. Through the clear plastic, I saw the cheap, stiff fabric of a literal black-and-white French-made uniform, complete with a ruffled white apron. I slowly raised my eyes to meet hers, maintaining my calm, serene composure. Brittany crossed her arms, her lips curling into a wicked, triumphant smirk. "Zack's parents are arriving at 6. She dictated, her voice dripping with sheer venom. "You will wear this, serve the champagne, and use the servants' entrance by the pantry. Do not speak unless spoken to. We cannot have Penelope and Arthur thinking we consider the hired help to be our equals. Zack's family comes from generational wealth and they expect a specific standard of service. I will not let you ruin my engagement with your awkward middle-class presence. Before I could process the sheer audacity of her demand, Bradley strode into the kitchen. He was freshly shaved and buttoned into his most expensive charcoal suit. He walked straight over to Brittany and planted a proud kiss on her cheek before turning his cold, calculating gaze toward me. He looked at the plastic-wrapped uniform sitting on the counter and did not bat a single eye. "Just play along, Olivia," he ordered, his tone devoid of any affection or basic human respect. My upcoming promotion entirely depends on networking with Zack's father tonight. Arthur is a senior executive who expects a certain level of traditional decorum and high-class service. We need to project the image of a wealthy, established household. If I can secure his backing, I will make managing partner by the fourth quarter. Do not sabotage this for me because of your fragile pride. He stepped closer, invading my personal space as he aggressively adjusted his silk tie in the reflection of the stainless steel refrigerator. "I built this lifestyle," he muttered, pointing a stiff finger directly at my chest. "I carry the heavy burden of providing for everyone. I fund this absolute luxury while you play with fabric swatches. The absolute least you can do to contribute to this marriage is put on that uniform and serve the drinks without making a massive scene. Be a team player for once in your life." I looked from Bradley to Brittany. They stood shoulder to shoulder, a united front of delusion and arrogance, entirely convinced they were the masters of their domain. They were demanding I dress as a servant in a multi-million-dollar property that I owned outright, serving food I had secretly paid for to impress people they were financially defrauding. It was a level of disrespect so profound it almost felt poetic. I picked up the plastic package from the counter. My fingers brushed the cheap synthetic material. I did not yell. I did not throw the caviar at them. I offered them both a sweet, compliant smile. "Of course," I replied smoothly. "I will go change immediately. I would not dream of ruining such an important evening for our family. I will make sure the champagne is perfectly chilled and ready by the servant's entrance." Brittany let out a short, mocking laugh, turning her back to me to inspect her makeup in the mirror. Bradley gave a sharp nod of approval, already pulling out his phone to check his emails, utterly convinced he had asserted his ultimate dominance. I walked out of the kitchen clutching the ridiculous uniform. I did not go upstairs to the master suite that they had stolen from me. I walked straight into the cramped downstairs den and firmly locked the heavy door behind me. I ripped open the plastic packaging and pulled out the scratchy black dress and the ridiculous white apron. I stripped off my comfortable clothes and put on the uniform. I smoothed the cheap fabric down my thighs, tying the apron strings tightly around my waist. I looked at myself in the small decorative mirror on the wall. I looked exactly like the hired help they wanted me to be. I walked over to the small desk and opened my laptop. The screen glowed brightly in the dim room. I opened my encrypted email client and pulled up a message I had drafted earlier that morning. It contained a comprehensive digital portfolio of Bradley's forged financial documents, the illegal LLC lease violations, and a formal request for immediate asset seizure regarding a vehicle tied to predatory loan fraud. The recipient address belonged directly to the local Sheriff's Department Criminal Investigations Division. I took a deep breath, resting my finger over the mouse pad. I listened to the sounds of Bradley and Brittany laughing in the kitchen, completely unaware of the storm gathering above their heads. I pressed down firmly and hit send. The heavy brass knocker on the front door chimed precisely at 6 o'clock. Bradley practically trampled over his own feet, rushing to the entryway, smoothing his lapels with clammy, shaking hands. I stood perfectly still by the swinging pantry door, holding a heavy silver tray loaded with 4 crystal flutes of vintage champagne. Through the sheer curtains of the sidelight windows, a massive midnight black Bentley idled in our circular driveway. A uniformed chauffeur was just closing the rear door. Penelope and Richard stepped onto the bluestone walkway, exuding the kind of manufactured superiority that Bradley worshipped. Penelope wore a severe emerald green dress and a string of pearls that looked heavy enough to cause neck trauma. Richard walked beside her with the stiff, unyielding posture of a man who spent his entire life firing people for sport. Bradley swung the heavy oak door wide open, plastering a desperate, overly eager smile across his flushed face. He ushered them into the grand foyer, bowing his head slightly as if greeting royalty. Brittany immediately glided down the curved staircase to join them, her arm tightly linked with Zack. The air instantly filled with the suffocating sound of fake pleasantries and exaggerated air kisses. I remained invisible in the shadows of the hallway, a silent spectator in my own home. I adjusted the starched white apron tied around my waist, balancing the silver tray on my fingertips. My secondary cell phone buzzed silently against my thigh, but I ignored it. Penelope stepped past Bradley without offering him a proper greeting. Her sharp eyes immediately darted around the two-story foyer, mentally cataloging every single architectural detail and piece of furniture. She marched directly into the formal living room, completely ignoring the carefully curated ambiance. She stopped in front of the carved marble fireplace. With a slow, deliberate motion, she raised her right hand and dragged her index finger across the pristine edge of the mantelpiece. She brought her finger up to her face, inspecting it for any microscopic trace of dust. Bradley hovered just a few feet behind her, a bead of sweat visibly rolling down his temple. He was completely out of his element, a desperate imposter trying to masquerade as an equal. Richard did not even bother looking at the house. He immediately cornered Bradley by the grand piano, launching into a dominating monologue about corporate acquisitions and executive ruthlessness. Bradley nodded frantically at every single word Richard spoke, violently agreeing with statements he clearly did not even understand. His desperation was palpable. He needed Richard to validate his existence. He needed Richard to secure his upcoming promotion. Brittany and Zack stood awkwardly near the arched doorway, watching the power dynamic unfold. Brittany shot me a vicious, commanding glare, flicking her wrist sharply to summon me forward. The time had come to play my assigned role. I stepped out of the shadows and walked slowly into the center of the formal living room. My black rubber-soled shoes made absolutely no sound against the polished hardwood floor. I approached the gathering with my chin lowered, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on the crystal flutes balancing on the silver tray. I stopped perfectly between Penelope and Brittany, offering the champagne with a practiced, subservient tilt of my head. Penelope did not even acknowledge my physical presence. She reached out blindly and snatched a glass from the tray, her gaze still sweeping critically over my imported silk drapes. Brittany grabbed a glass next her diamond engagement ring, catching the light from the chandelier. She leaned toward Penelope, pitching her voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. "Our live-in help is a bit slow this evening," Brittany announced, gesturing toward me with a dismissive wave of her hand. We try to keep her strictly in the kitchen, but good serving staff is just so impossible to find locally. Penelope finally tore her eyes away from the decor and looked at me. She stared at my scratchy uniform and plain apron with unfiltered disgust. She took a slow sip of her champagne. "Good help is indeed so hard to find these days," Penelope sneered, her voice echoing loudly in the quiet room. She turned her sharp gaze toward Bradley, who had just rushed over to join the circle. "Does she even speak English?" Bradley did not hesitate for a single fraction of a second. He looked right at me, completely disowning his own wife of 5 years just to impress a wealthy snob he had met 10 minutes ago. Barely enough to get by, Bradley lied smoothly, offering Richard and Penelope a pathetic, apologetic shrug. "We mostly just communicate with hand gestures and pointing. It is a charitable arrangement, really. We provide her with a room in the basement, and she keeps the property maintained." Richard let out a loud, booming laugh, clapping Bradley hard on the shoulder. "That is the spirit, Wilson," Richard boomed. "Keep overhead low and expectations high." I stood perfectly still like a marble statue holding a tray. I did not flinch. I did not drop my gaze. I stepped forward and moved directly in front of Penelope. I picked up the heavy crystal bottle from the tray and tipped it forward to top off her half-empty flute. The golden liquid bubbled and hissed perfectly to the brim. I set the bottle down. I slowly raised my head and looked Penelope dead in her sharp, judgmental eyes. I dropped the subservient posture, entirely squaring my shoulders, and standing at my full height, I offered her a bright, chilling smile. Votre robe est une contrefaçon bon marché, et votre fils est un parasite, I stated in flawless, unaccented French. The translation was simple. Your dress is a cheap knockoff, and your son is a parasite. Penelope suddenly froze entirely. Her fake smile completely evaporated from her face as she rapidly processed the harsh, calculated insult. The entire formal living room descended into a sudden, absolutely suffocating silence. Penelope gasped a ragged intake of air that sucked the oxygen out of the room. Her contoured face contorted into absolute horror. She stumbled backward, her designer heels clicking frantically against the hardwood as if trying to distance herself from my unaccented French. She knew what I said. The translation echoed in the sudden, suffocating silence. Your dress is a cheap knockoff and your son is a parasite. Her mouth opened and closed silently, like a suffocating fish entirely stripped of her aristocratic armor. Richard stared in bewilderment, ignorant of the language, but acutely aware the power dynamic had shifted. Bradley looked like he might pass out his eyes, darting frantically, desperately trying to comprehend how his subservient maid had verbally decimated his corporate networking target. Zack stood frozen, completely useless in the face of actual conflict. I stood my ground, my posture straight, waiting for the explosion. Before Penelope could recover her breath to scream, Brittany sprang into action. She saw her future mother humiliated and realized her entire engagement was dangling by a frayed thread. Her eyes narrowed into dangerous, spiteful slits. She lunged forward, bridging the short distance between us with the speed of a cornered animal. I saw the malice burning in her gaze, but I was boxed in by the marble fireplace and the coffee table. As I shifted my weight to turn away, Brittany thrust her right leg into my path. She hooked her stiletto behind my ankle and shoved her shoulder into my chest. Gravity seized control. My feet flew out from under me, tearing my balance away. I pitched forward, the silver tray flying from my grasp. The 4 crystal flutes launched into the air like projectiles, spinning wildly before gravity yanked them back down toward the floorboards. Time slowed to a crawl as I braced for the collision. The crash was deafening. Shattered crystal exploded outward in a wave of sharp glass shrapnel. The champagne erupted like a geyser, showering the area in a frothy cascade of golden liquid. I hit the floor hard, my knees and palms taking the brutal brunt of the impact, sending shockwaves of sharp pain radiating up my arms. The absolute best part of the chaotic descent was the trajectory of the falling champagne. A massive splash of the sticky alcohol landed directly onto Penelope's feet. The liquid soaked deeply into the fabric of her incredibly expensive designer shoes. Penelope let out a piercing shriek of pure agony, staring down at her ruined footwear, as if I had poured corrosive acid over her toes. She hopped backward frantically, shaking her feet, splattering even more champagne across the Persian rug. Brittany did not waste a second capitalizing on the orchestrated disaster. She pointed a trembling finger at me as I struggled to push myself up. "You stupid, clumsy maid," Brittany screamed. "Look at what you have done! You completely ruined her shoes! Dad, fire her right now! Get her out of my sight!" Bradley snapped out of his stunned paralysis. The sight of his daughter screaming, and the wealthy executive's wife hyperventilating over her soaked shoes, sent him into sheer panic. He charged across the living room, his face a dangerous shade of purple. He did not ask if I was injured. He lunged at me, his large hands clamping down brutally hard around my upper arm. His fingers dug deeply into my flesh, an aggressive grip designed to physically dominate and intimidate. He yanked me upward with a violent jerk, ignoring my wince of pain as my shoulder popped in protest. "Get up on your feet!" he growled, his voice a terrifying rumble of barely contained rage. He began dragging me backward, hauling me roughly toward the swinging pantry doors that led back into the kitchen. I stumbled awkwardly, my shoes slipping slightly on the slick floor, forcing me to fight just to stay upright. Richard and Penelope watched the brutal display of physical control with horrified eyes, completely silent as Bradley hauled me far away. Bradley pushed through the swinging doors, practically throwing me into the stark lighting of the kitchen. I stumbled forward, crashing against the quartz island to catch my balance. He rounded on me, invading my personal space, until I could smell the stale coffee and nervous sweat radiating off his skin. "You are ruining my life," Bradley hissed, his face inches from mine, his eyes bulging with wild fury. "I have given you everything. I feed you, I house you, I put the actual roof over your head, and this is how you repay me. You humiliated my daughter in front of the most important networking contact of my career. You spoke out of turn, you insulted a guest, and then you threw champagne like an ungrateful child. I built this incredible lifestyle from nothing. I grind every single day to maintain this luxury. The least you could do is pour a drink without destroying my entire future." I looked at the man practically foaming at the mouth, spouting lies about providing for me while standing inside a house he was legally stealing. He raised his hand, pointing a shaking finger between my eyes. Before Bradley could utter another word or push me further back against the marble counters, a loud, commanding noise echoed from the front of the house. The front door of the mansion swung open, slamming against the interior wall with a sound like a gunshot. The thud of tactical boots echoed across the marble foyer, instantly silencing the panicked guests in the living room. Bradley froze, his finger still suspended in the air, his head whipping around toward the sudden disruption. I stepped out from behind the kitchen island, peering carefully through the window of the pantry door. Standing squarely in the center of the grand foyer, radiating absolute authority, was Kendra. Her tailored blazer looked perfectly pressed, her expression completely merciless. And standing behind her, hands resting on their utility belts, were two uniformed police officers. The hired string quartet in the corner of the formal living room abruptly stopped playing. The sudden jarring scrape of the cellist's bow across the strings sounded like a dying animal cutting through the suffocating tension of the room. The 50 high society guests froze instantly in their places. Crystal champagne flutes hovered suspended halfway to their mouths. The low, pretentious hum of corporate networking and wealthy gossip died out completely. Everyone turned their heads toward the grand foyer, their eyes wide with shock. The heavy oak front door of the mansion had swung open with the force of a battering ram, and the authoritative thud of tactical boots now echoed against the imported marble floors. Bradley stood absolutely paralyzed by the kitchen entrance. His bruising grip on my arm suddenly vanished, his fingers springing open as if he had just been electrocuted. He stared past me, his eyes bulging out of his head as he registered the impossible sight unfolding in his supposedly perfect home. Standing squarely in the center of the foyer, radiating an aura of absolute, uncompromising power, was Kendra. Her tailored black blazer was sharply pressed, and she held a heavy leather briefcase in her left hand. Flanking her on either side, their hands resting cautiously on their heavy utility belts, were two fully uniformed police officers. The visual contrast between the officers in their dark, imposing uniforms and the 50 guests draped in expensive cocktail attire was staggering. Bradley's face mutated through a rapid sequence of emotions. First came utter confusion, followed closely by a flash of deep, primal fear, and finally settling into a mask of aggressive, desperate outrage. He puffed out his chest desperately, attempting to inflate his physical presence to match the executive authority he faked. He stormed away from the kitchen, his leather dress shoes slapping loudly against the hardwood as he marched directly up to Kendra. "What is the meaning of this?" Bradley demanded, his voice echoing shrilly across the silent foyer. He pointed a trembling finger toward the open doorway, completely ignoring the two armed officers standing just inches away from him. "You cannot be here, Kendra. This is a private, exclusive event. Get out of my house immediately before I call the cops and have you arrested for trespassing." Kendra did not flinch. She did not take a single step backward. She simply tilted her head, offering him a slow, predatory smile that sent a visible chill down his spine. She raised her right hand and lightly tapped her manicured fingers against the side of her heavy leather briefcase. The dull, rhythmic thud echoed in the quiet space. "You do not need to call them, Bradley." Kendra replied, her voice smooth, level, and carrying clearly to the back of the room. "I brought them with me." A collective horrified gasp rippled through the crowd of wealthy guests. Penelope clutched her string of pearls tightly, taking a deliberate, hurried step backward to distance herself from the unfolding scandal. Richard's eyes narrowed sharply. His corporate survival instincts instantly kicked in. He recognized a catastrophic liability when he saw one, and he immediately began edging toward the grand staircase, wanting absolutely no association with whatever criminal element was about to be exposed. Bradley saw Richard pulling away, and pure panic flooded his system. His entire career, his upcoming promotion, and his desperate social climbing were evaporating right before his eyes. He frantically turned his back on Kendra and the police officers, holding his hands up in a pleading, placating gesture toward Richard. He pasted on a sickeningly sweet, entirely unconvincing smile. "This is just my wife's unstable sister-in-law, Bradley," stammered, sweat visibly beading on his forehead and dripping onto his expensive collar. "She is always causing drama because she is completely jealous of my success. She has a history of severe mental health episodes and completely fabricated delusions. We will have her escorted off the premises right now. Please enjoy the caviar." I stepped out from the shadows of the swinging pantry doors. I walked very slowly into the bright light of the foyer, my rubber-soled shoes silent against the floorboards. I reached behind my back, grasped the strings of the scratchy white apron they had forced me to wear, and untied the knot. I let the cheap fabric slide off my waist and drop unceremoniously onto the expensive Persian rug. I smoothed down my dress and walked directly over to stand shoulder to shoulder with Kendra. I looked at Bradley, offering him a serene, victorious smile. The power dynamic in the room entirely shattered, shifting permanently and irreversibly to my side. Brittany was hyperventilating near the bottom of the staircase, clutching Zack's arm so tightly her knuckles were completely white. Zack looked utterly lost, staring at the police officers as if they were aliens from another planet. The 50 guests began to whisper furiously, pulling out their smartphones to record the disastrous downfall of the Wilson family. The two police officers were completely unamused by Bradley's frantic, pathetic posturing. Their eyes swept over the lavish party decorations, the towering arrangements of imported flowers, the expensive catering spread, and the waitstaff cowering in the corners. They were looking at the undeniable waste of money that they knew had been illegally obtained through predatory loan fraud and unauthorized lease violations. They looked back at Bradley, their expressions hardening into masks of professional, uncompromising duty. The lead police officer, a tall man with a stern, weathered face, took a heavy, deliberate step forward. He moved directly past Bradley, ignoring his desperate attempts to maintain control of the situation. The officer reached into his uniform pocket, extracting a thick, neatly folded document. He unrolled the paper with a sharp flick of his wrist. It was an official court-stamped document covered in heavy black ink and legally binding signatures. He cleared his throat, his deep voice easily cutting through the panicked whispers of the remaining party guests. "Is there a Bradley Vance residing at this address?" "I am Bradley," he announced, puffing out his chest and lifting his chin in a desperate display of authority. He deliberately adjusted his expensive silk tie, trying to project the image of a powerful executive rather than a cornered animal. "I am the master of this house." "What exactly seems to be the problem, officer?" "As you can plainly see, we are in the middle of hosting a very important, highly exclusive engagement event for my daughter. You are severely disrupting a private gathering of esteemed guests." The lead police officer did not blink. His expression remained carved from granite, utterly unimpressed by Bradley and his fabricated display of wealth. The officer stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and firmly thrust the heavy court-stamped document directly against Bradley's chest. Sir, we are here to execute an emergency eviction order on behalf of the legal property owner, Apex Holdings LLC, the officer stated, his voice booming through the completely silent foyer. Due to severe documented lease violations and fraudulent financial activity, you and all unauthorized occupants have exactly 60 minutes to vacate the premises. The words dropped like live grenades onto the polished hardwood floor. The collective gasp from the 50 high society guests sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the grand room. The ambient clinking of crystal glasses ceased entirely. People shifted uncomfortably, their eyes wide with morbid fascination, as the carefully constructed illusion of the Wilson family wealth shattered into a million irreparable pieces. Bradley stared at the document in his hands, as if it were coated in highly toxic poison. The color rapidly drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly pale gray under the bright chandelier lights. "This is an absolute mistake," Bradley stammered, his voice suddenly losing all its booming corporate resonance. "There has to be a clerical error in the system. I have a long-term arrangement. You cannot simply throw us out onto the street in the middle of the night. We have guests. We have rights." The second police officer rested his hand firmly on his utility belt, stepping forward to flank his partner. "You have exactly 59 minutes left, sir," the second officer corrected smoothly. "If you do not willingly vacate, we are legally authorized to physically remove you." Brittany shoved her way past Zack, her designer heels slipping slightly on the rug. Her face was contorted into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. She snatched the eviction notice from her father's trembling hands and stared at the bold black lettering. "This is a massive mistake," Brittany screamed, her voice cracking into a shrill, hysterical pitch. She wildly pointed a manicured finger at the officers. "My dad bought this house for me. This is my engagement present. We own this estate. Tell them, Dad. Tell them you own the ground they are standing on right now." Bradley could not look at his daughter. He could not look at the police officers. Most importantly, he could not bring himself to look at Richard or Penelope. He simply stared at the floor, his entire body shaking with the physical manifestation of his complete social ruin. Penelope stepped forward, her emerald green dress rustling loudly in the deadly quiet room. She looked Bradley up and down with an expression of such profound disgust it could have frozen water. "You do not own this house," Penelope asked, her tone dripping with absolute unfiltered revulsion. "You are a renter." The word renter hung in the air, a filthy insult in the circles Penelope and Richard operated within. She turned her sharp, judgmental gaze toward Brittany, inspecting the crying girl, as if she were a piece of rotting garbage left on the sidewalk. "You paraded us into this house pretending to be our equals." Penelope sneered, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "You allowed us to believe you came from generational wealth. You are nothing but common frauds. We will absolutely not be associating our family name with this pathetic, humiliating circus. Come along, Richard. We are leaving immediately." Richard did not need to be told twice. He was already halfway to the front door, practically sprinting to escape the social contagion of the Wilson family. Zack stood rooted to the spot, looking back and forth between his furious mother and his hysterical fiancée. Brittany reached out frantically, grabbing his tailored sleeve. "Zack, please, you have to do something." Brittany begged, heavy tears ruining her meticulous makeup. "It is just a mistake. My dad will fix it. He has the money." Zack slowly peeled her fingers off his jacket, shaking his head with a look of utter pity. "I cannot do this, Brittany," Zack muttered, taking a massive step backward. "My parents are right. This whole thing is a complete lie." He turned and practically jogged out the front door, following his parents into the dark, damp night. Brittany let out a guttural shriek, collapsing onto the bottom step of the grand staircase, sobbing uncontrollably into her hands. Her entire future, her wealthy marriage, her perfect social status, had all just evaporated in less than 5 minutes. Bradley was hyperventilating now, his chest heaving as he desperately patted his pockets, searching for a miraculous lifeline. He yanked his smartphone out of his jacket pocket, his thumbs flying across the screen with erratic, uncoordinated movements. "I am calling the property management company directly," Bradley announced to the room, his voice shaking with wild, frantic desperation. I have the emergency contact number for Apex Holdings LLC right here saved in my files. I will clear this entire ridiculous misunderstanding up right now and fix everything." He pressed the phone to his ear, his eyes wide with blind, suffocating panic as he waited for someone to answer the call. Across the silent, crowded living room, a sharp, upbeat corporate ringtone suddenly pierced the heavy tension. It was ringing very loudly from inside the deep pocket of my discarded maid uniform, echoing across the marble floor. The sharp corporate ringtone echoed off the marble walls, cutting through the silence of the foyer. The 50 wealthy guests instantly froze. Every head in the room slowly turned toward the noise. The sound was not coming from Bradley, it was coming directly from me. I stood calmly next to Kendra, feeling the heavy vibration against my thigh. With deliberate movements, I reached deep into the pocket of my black uniform dress. I slowly pulled out the secondary cell phone. The bright screen illuminated my face. In bold letters, the caller ID displayed a single name, Bradley Vance. Bradley lowered his smartphone, his hand trembling so violently he nearly dropped the device. His face went chalk white, all the blood draining from his cheeks. He stared at the glowing screen in my hand, his mouth opening and closing as his brain desperately tried to process the connection. The upbeat ringtone continued to chirp, mocking his confusion. I held his gaze without blinking, raised my thumb, and pressed the red decline button. The ringing abruptly stopped. The silence that followed was absolute. "Why?" Bradley stammered, his voice barely a hoarse whisper. He took a hesitant step forward, pointing a shaking finger at the device in my hand. "Why do you have the landlord's phone?" I did not answer him immediately. I reached behind my back, grasping the strings of the maid's apron. I untied the tight knot with a single fluid motion. I pulled the fabric over my head and let it drop to the floor. The white apron pooled around my rubber-soled shoes, a physical shedding of the subservient role I had played. I squared my shoulders, lifting my chin to look down at the man who had tormented and belittled me. "Because Bradley," I stated, my voice carrying clear and strong, "I am the landlord." The collective gasp from the guests was deafening. Brittany, who was still slumped on the bottom step of the staircase, stopped sobbing. She lifted her tear-streaked face, staring at me with uncomprehending eyes. Bradley stumbled backward as if I had physically struck him across the jaw. He shook his head side to side. "No?" Bradley choked out, a nervous laugh escaping his throat. "No, that is impossible. That is absolutely insane. You are a maid. You live in the basement. I pay rent to a massive corporate conglomerate. Apex Holdings is a multinational real estate firm." Kendra stepped forward, her heels clicking authoritatively against the marble. She reached into her briefcase and extracted a thick, professionally bound stack of corporate filings. She did not hand them to Bradley. Instead, she turned toward the heavy oak front door. Penelope and Richard had frozen near the exit, trapped by their morbid curiosity. Kendra walked directly up to the wealthy couple and thrust the official documents into Penelope's hands. "Olivia is the sole proprietor of Apex Holdings," Kendra announced, her voice ringing out with legal certainty. "She bought this house in cash 5 years ago. Bradley has been paying her rent every month, which she graciously put into a high-yield savings account under her own name." Penelope looked down at the documents, her sharp eyes scanning the bold legal print. Richard leaned over her shoulder, reading the clear designation of ownership. The undeniable truth was printed right there in black and white. Richard looked up at Bradley, his expression shifting from disgust to a twisted form of pity. The man who had been bragging about his corporate acquisitions all evening was nothing but a tenant funding his own maid's investment accounts. "This is a mistake!" Brittany shrieked, scrambling up from the stairs. She lunged toward Kendra, but the 2 police officers immediately stepped into her path. Brittany recoiled, her face twisting into a mask of pure rage. "My dad bought this house for me. This is my engagement present. You are lying. You are just a pathetic, jealous loser trying to ruin my perfect night." "The only person who ruined this night is your father," Kendra replied sharply. "He forged Olivia's signature on a fraudulent sublet agreement. He took out massive personal loans using this property as collateral, pretending he owned the title. The eviction order is perfectly legal binding and effective immediately. Bradley looked like a man standing on the gallows. He turned his desperate gaze back to me, his eyes pleading for a reprieve that was never going to come. "Olivia, please." He begged, his arrogant corporate persona entirely stripped away. "You cannot do this to us. We are family. Where are we supposed to go? You cannot throw us out onto the street with nothing." "You threw me out a long time ago, Bradley," I replied, my voice completely devoid of sympathy. "You treated me like dirt. You made me serve your guests, clean your messes, and endure your constant disrespect. You thought you could step all over me because you thought you held the power. But you never held the power. You just held the lease." The lead police officer stepped forward. "You have exactly 45 minutes left to gather your essential personal belongings and vacate the premises." The officer commanded his tone, leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "If you are not off this property by the time that clock runs out, you will be forcibly removed for criminal trespassing. I suggest you start packing right now." The harsh reality finally crashed down on the Wilson family. Bradley fell to his knees on the marble floor, his hands covering his face as he let out a loud, pathetic sob. Brittany began screaming hysterically, stamping her feet like a spoiled toddler denied a toy. The wealthy guests began moving toward the door together, eager to escape the humiliating scene. Penelope dropped the corporate documents onto a nearby console table, grabbed Richard's arm, and practically ran out the front door into the night. I stood perfectly still, silently watching the massive empire of lies completely crumble into fine dust. The guests on the perimeter held their smartphones high to capture the disaster. Bradley stayed on the floor, gasping for air in ragged bursts. His chest heaved as his mind struggled to process the magnitude of his humiliation. He looked at me, his face glistening with sweat. Then a desperate spark of defiance ignited in his bloodshot eyes. He scrambled to his feet, nearly slipping on the polished stone, and wiped his face with his tailored sleeve. He squared his shoulders, attempting to resurrect the executive persona that had just been obliterated. "You cannot kick me out!" Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with manic desperation as he pointed an accusing finger at my face. He took a heavy step forward, though the police officers shifted to block his path. "We are legally married. We took vows. That makes this mansion a marital asset. You can wave around corporate paperwork, but I have been paying into this property for the duration of our marriage. I have poured thousands of dollars into this estate every single month. By law, I am entitled to exactly half the value of this house and half of whatever secret fortune you hoarded away. I will drag you through divorce court and strip you of every dime." Kendra let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut cleanly through his frantic legal threats. She stepped smoothly around the police officers, positioning herself directly in front of Bradley. She reached back into her heavy leather briefcase and retrieved a thin blue folder, holding it up like a freshly sharpened blade. "You truly are a special kind of stupid, Bradley," Kendra stated, her voice dripping with absolute condescension. "You are not going to drag anyone into divorce court, and you are certainly not claiming a single penny." She flipped the blue folder open, extracting a crisp, notarized document bearing his bold signature at the bottom of the page. "Do you remember signing this document 3 days before your wedding? You probably do not, because you barely glanced at the pages before scribbling your name. You were convinced Olivia was a penniless nobody. You were so terrified she might lay claim to your corporate salary and leased luxury car that you aggressively demanded an ironclad prenuptial agreement." Bradley stared at the document, his mouth falling open as the memory of his own arrogant mistake crashed down upon him. He had forced that paperwork on me, presenting it as a strict ultimatum to protect his pathetic assets. "You demanded total financial separation," Kendra continued loudly, ensuring every recording smartphone caught the humiliating details. "You legally waived all rights to her premarital property, her future business earnings, and her corporate entities. You completely insulated her wealth from your greedy grasp. The monthly payments you made were never contributing to a shared mortgage. You essentially signed a legally binding lease as a tenant. You paid rent, Bradley. You funded her lucrative savings account because you were too arrogant to read the fine print of the trap you demanded she sign. You played yourself. Bradley physically recoiled, the remaining color draining from his face until he looked like a walking corpse. He opened his mouth to argue, but no sound came out. The finality of his financial ruin left him entirely paralyzed. I stepped forward, moving past Kendra to address the man who had tormented me for years. I turned my gaze outward, looking at the sea of wealthy guests who had spent the evening completely ignoring my existence. "He loved to tell all of you how hard he worked to provide for me," I announced, projecting my voice clearly across the foyer. "He loved to parade me around as his charity case. In the privacy of this house, he told me my business was a little hobby that would never amount to anything. He looked me in the eye and told me I was a leech draining his resources. He belittled my intelligence, mocked my background, and constantly threatened to throw me out if I did not perfectly submit to his ridiculous demands. Meanwhile, I sat back and let him play king of the castle. I let him buy expensive furniture for my house. I let him boast to his friends about my property. I wanted to see exactly how far his ego would go before it inevitably imploded." The crowd remained utterly silent, hanging on to my every word. I turned my attention back to Bradley, who was now trembling so violently, his teeth were practically chattering. "You are not a king, Bradley," I stated, my tone dropping to a chilling whisper. "You are just a terrible guest who overstayed his welcome, and your lease is officially terminated." Brittany stood frozen by the staircase, her mind frantically calculating the devastating reality of her new situation. The luxury cars, the endless credit cards, the country club memberships, and the massive generational wealth she had promised her future in-laws were completely gone. The free luxury ride she had taken for granted was abruptly over. Panic seized her features as she pivoted sharply toward Zack. She reached out her fingers, clawing at his jacket sleeve. "Zack, you have to do something right now!" Brittany shrieked, her voice echoing shrilly against the marble walls. "Do not just stand there like an idiot. Call your dad. Tell him to get his corporate lawyers on the phone. We can sue her for fraud. We can tie this fake eviction up in court for years. Make them fix this, Zack. You owe me." Zack stared at her, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and sheer revulsion. He looked down at her hands gripping his jacket, then slowly raised his gaze to meet her furious, entitled glare. He forcefully jerked his arm backward, breaking her grip and stepping far away from her, as if she carried a deadly disease. A look of pure, unadulterated disgust washed over his face, cementing the absolute and final end of their toxic relationship there. Penelope released the brass handle of the front door, halting her retreat. The polished veneer of the high society matriarch completely vanished, replaced by a cold, calculating fury. She pivoted sharply, her emerald green dress swishing violently as she marched back into the center of the grand foyer. She ignored the police officers, locking her piercing gaze onto Bradley, who remained kneeling on the marble floor. The remaining guests held their collective breath. Penelope stood over him, radiating absolute contempt. "You invited us here under false pretenses," Penelope hissed, her voice slicing through the heavy silence. She pointed a manicured finger directly at his face. "You paraded my family through these halls boasting about your real estate acquisitions and generational wealth. You sat at my dining table and looked down your nose at people who work for a living. And now we find out you are nothing but a middle management fraud living off your wife's wealth." Bradley shrank away from her accusing finger, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Richard stormed up right behind his wife, his face flushed an angry crimson. The wealthy patriarch of the Thornton family had zero tolerance for public humiliation, and Bradley had dragged their pristine reputation into a puddle of cheap fraud. Richard reached out and forcefully grabbed Zack by the arm, yanking his son backward and away from the hysterical Brittany. "We are leaving this instant," Richard barked, his voice echoing loudly. "And you, boy, are done with this trailer trash family. The Thorntons do not associate with con artists and criminals." Zack stumbled under his father's grip. He looked shell-shocked, his eyes darting wildly between his furious parents, the unyielding police officers, and the sobbing woman he had planned to marry. He tried to pull his arm out of his father's grasp, taking a half step back toward his fiancée. "Wait. Dad, Hold on a second, Zack protested weakly. Maybe we should just slow down and figure out exactly what is happening here. Penelope snapped her head toward her son, her eyes flashing with maternal rage. She stepped directly into his line of sight, completely blocking his view of Brittany. Figure out what is happening, Penelope demanded, her tone rising to a shrill pitch. Are you entirely blind? Zack, open your eyes and look at these people. She does not even have a bedroom in this house, Zack. They have been lying to us since the very first day you introduced her to our family. Zack froze, the words hitting him with physical force. Penelope gestured wildly around the foyer, her diamond bracelets catching the light overhead. Everything Brittany told you was a carefully constructed fabrication, Penelope continued. She claimed this estate was her childhood home. She bragged about her massive inheritance and luxury lifestyle. But it was all a pathetic illusion. They are broke, Zack. They are fraudulent tenants being evicted by the woman they treated like a servant. They set a trap for our wealth, and you walked right into it like an absolute fool. Penelope's harsh words finally penetrated Zack's shock. He turned to look at Brittany, seeing her not as the wealthy socialite she had pretended to be, but as a desperate fraud. The lead police officer stepped forward. You now have 35 minutes to vacate this property, the officer announced loudly. I suggest you stop arguing and start gathering your things. My partner and I will escort you upstairs to pack your essential belongings right now. The command sparked a frantic panic in Brittany. The realization that she was actually being thrown out onto the street superseded her desperate desire to hold on to Zack. She let out a guttural shriek, scrambled up from the stairs, and sprinted toward the main hallway. My bags! Brittany screamed hysterically. My designer bags are in the coat closet. She yanked the heavy doors open, dragging out 3 massive monogrammed luxury suitcases. She hauled the heavy luggage into the center of the foyer. She unzipped them on the floor, frantically stuffing random coats, shoes, and expensive accessories inside. The meticulous, poised image she had cultivated for years was completely destroyed. She looked like a feral animal digging through garbage. Zack stood perfectly still, watching the greedy display unfolding on the marble floor. He watched Brittany shoving a handful of expensive silk scarves into an overflowing suitcase, completely ignoring her father weeping quietly in the corner. He processed the absolute magnitude of the lie. She had never loved him. She had only ever loved the financial security and social status his last name provided. He realized that if he married her, he would spend the rest of his life funding the endless hollow vanity of a family that possessed absolutely no moral compass. Brittany struggled to pull the zipper closed on the overstuffed luggage. She looked up, her face streaked with ruined mascara and sweat. Zack, she begged, taking on a whiny, manipulative tone. Tell them to wait. Tell your driver to pull the car around so we can load my bags. I am ready to go with you. Zack looked at the packed suitcases, then slowly raised his eyes to meet hers. The last remaining shred of affection in his heart permanently extinguished, replaced by a cold, hollow emptiness. He straightened his tailored jacket. It is over, Brittany, Zack stated, his voice dead and devoid of any emotion. Do not ever call me again. He turned his back on her without waiting for a response. He walked briskly out the front door, falling into step right beside his parents as they marched toward their waiting limousine. The heavy oak door swung shut behind them with a loud final thud, sealing the Wilsons' fate. Brittany stared at the closed door for 3 agonizing seconds before her knees gave out. She collapsed onto the hard marble floor directly beside her overstuffed luggage, burying her face in her hands and sobbing uncontrollably as the ticking clock of her eviction marched steadily downward. Brittany stayed on this marble floor for exactly 10 seconds after the heavy oak door slammed shut. The whimpering ceased, replaced by a low guttural growl that vibrated in the back of her throat. She pushed herself up from the cold stone, her tear-stained face contorting into a terrifying mask of absolute fury. Her carefully manicured hands curled into tight fists. She spun toward me, her eyes wild and completely unhinged. She lunged toward the grand mahogany console table near the arched entryway, her fingers desperately grabbing a massive, incredibly heavy crystal centerpiece overflowing with imported white roses and fresh greenery. With a primal scream, she hoisted the heavy vase above her head and hurled it directly at the floor. The thick crystal shattered into 1,000 jagged pieces. Ice-cold water shattered green stems, and bruised white flower petals violently exploded across the pristine, polished marble flooring, creating a dangerous and slippery mess. She did not stop there. She grabbed a polished silver serving tray laden with expensive, towering crystal champagne flutes and flipped it violently into the air. Glass rained down, echoing like gunfire in the cavernous foyer. "You completely ruined my entire life!" Brittany shrieked, her harsh, grating voice painfully tearing through her own throat in raw desperation. "You ruined my engagement. You ruined my future. I was going to be a Thornton. I was going to have everything. You are just a jealous, bitter maid who could not stand to see me happy." She reached for a decorative bronze statue, her fingers clawing at the heavy metal base, preparing to launch it across the room. Before she could lift the statue, the lead police officer unclipped his baton and stepped directly into her path. He pointed a rigid finger at her chest. "Put the statue down immediately," the officer commanded, his voice booming with absolute authority. "If you break one more item in this house, I will place you in handcuffs, drag you out to my cruiser, and book you for felony vandalism and destruction of private property. Do you understand me?" Brittany instantly froze in her tracks, her narrow chest violently heaving up and down as she frantically panted for breathable air. She looked at the cold steel of the handcuffs resting on the officer's utility belt. Slowly, her fingers uncurled from the bronze statue. She let it drop back onto the table with a heavy thud, shrinking away from the officer as the threat of jail time finally pierced through her hysterical rage. Bradley, who had been cowering near the staircase during his daughter's destructive rampage, saw an opportunity to shift the blame. He pushed himself off the wall and marched toward me, carefully stepping over the shattered crystal and bruised white roses scattered across the floor. He puffed out his chest, desperately trying to summon the patriarchal authority he had wielded over me for years. He deliberately looked down his nose at me, his aging, sweaty face dramatically twisted into an exaggerated expression of profound, deeply wounded betrayal. "How could you possibly do this to us?" Bradley demanded, his voice thick with fabricated heartbreak. "After everything I have provided for you, I generously put a very expensive, highly coveted roof directly over your undeserving head. I allowed you to live in this magnificent estate. I gave you a place in this family when you had absolutely nothing. I took care of you, Olivia. I protected you. And this is how you repay my generosity. By so viciously and publicly humiliating my innocent daughter and maliciously throwing us out into the freezing, unforgiving, cold night air, you are a cold, ungrateful monster." I stared at him, letting his pathetic, desperate words hang in the air. Then a genuine laugh bubbled up from my chest. It started small, a soft chuckle that quickly grew into a full, resonant laugh that echoed off the vaulted ceilings. Bradley flinched deeply, unsettled by my complete lack of remorse. "Provided," I repeated, shaking my head in pure amusement. "Are you seriously standing in my foyer surrounded by your daughters, shattered delusions trying to claim you provided for me? You drained your entire retirement, 401k, to pay for a caterer and a string quartet for a party in a house you do not even own. You bankrupted your future to impress a family of snobs who absolutely despise you. The only thing you provided was a masterclass in stupidity." I took a deliberate step forward, forcing him to retreat. "You diligently paid down my massive mortgage every month, utilizing your standard corporate salary. You eagerly funded my booming, high-yield investment accounts while bitterly complaining to me about the rising cost of basic household groceries. You thought you were the master of the universe, barking orders at me while I served your morning coffee. But every single time you handed over a rent check, you were just building my empire. You never provided a single thing, Bradley. You were just a highly profitable, incredibly arrogant tenant." Bradley opened his mouth, desperately searching for a comeback, but his mind was entirely blank. He possessed absolutely no financial leverage, zero disposable money, and absolutely no remaining social power left to wield against anyone. He looked at the broken glass at his sobbing daughter, and finally at the eviction notice still clutched in his trembling hand. He suddenly looked entirely, utterly broken. Just as he turned back toward his packed suitcases, preparing to finally accept his humiliating defeat, Kendra stepped out from behind me. She deliberately reached her hand deep into her slim black leather briefcase and slowly pulled out one final, remarkably thick, crisp white envelope. Her stiletto heels clicked sharply as she closed the distance between them. She held the envelope out, her face completely void of any sympathy. "Oh, Bradley," Kendra announced, her voice ringing with crisp professional finality. "We are certainly not quite finished right here yet. There is still one more special delivery just for you tonight." Kendra held the thick, crisp white envelope out toward Bradley. He stared at it as if it were a venomous snake. His hands remained glued to his sides. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer volume of consequences crashing down upon him. Kendra did not wait for him to accept it. She stepped forward and forcefully pressed the envelope directly against his chest, forcing him to grab it before it hit the floor. The legal documents felt heavy in his trembling hands. He looked down at the embossed seal of Kendra's law firm, his eyes wide with rising terror. He slowly tore the flap open, pulling out the pristine papers. His bloodshot eyes scanned the bold black lettering at the top of the page. The words did not compute in his panicked brain. He looked up at Kendra, his expression completely vacant. Kendra adjusted her glasses, her voice echoing with absolute authority across the foyer. "As your landlord, Olivia, is evicting you," Kendra stated, ensuring every word reached the ears of the police officers standing nearby. "As your wife, she is officially divorcing you. And as a victim of financial fraud, she is suing you for every remaining asset to your name." Bradley physically staggered backward. His mouth opened and closed, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. He looked from Kendra to me, deep confusion washing over his sweaty face. He did not understand the final accusation. He thought his financial manipulations were completely airtight. He thought he had successfully hidden his tracks beneath layers of corporate jargon. He shook his head wildly. "Fraud." Bradley choked out, his voice cracking into a pathetic squeak. "What are you talking about? I never committed any fraud against Olivia. I paid the rent. I paid the bills. We kept our finances entirely separate, exactly like the prenuptial agreement dictated. I did not touch a single penny of her money." Kendra let out a sharp, mocking laugh that cut through his desperate defense. "You really believe you covered your tracks," she said, shaking her head. "You drained your retirement accounts to fund this pathetic illusion of wealth. You maxed out every credit card in your name to pay for Brittany's designer clothes and this engagement party. But when that money ran out last month, you panicked. You realized you could not afford to keep the caterers without a massive influx of immediate cash. So you went looking for a shortcut. You bypassed traditional banks because your credit score is lower than your actual age. You went straight to a high-interest payday loan company operating out of a strip mall. You took out a massive personal loan with an astronomical interest rate just to keep this charade alive for one more night." Bradley swallowed hard. "Yes, I took out a loan," he admitted, his voice defensive. "But that is my own personal debt. That has nothing to do with Olivia. I signed those papers myself." I stepped out from behind Kendra, closing the distance between myself and the man I was about to destroy. "You did sign the papers yourself, Bradley," I said, my voice cold and steady. "But you did not just sign your own name. You needed a guarantor. You needed someone with flawless credit and verified assets to back up a loan of that size. The loan company demanded collateral you simply did not possess. So you forged my signature as a co-signer. You listed my corporate real estate assets as collateral for your party loan." Bradley froze. Blood drained from his face, leaving his skin a sickly, translucent shade of gray. "You thought I would not notice a hard inquiry on my credit report?" I asked coldly. "I monitor my corporate and personal finances meticulously. I receive instant notifications the second anyone runs a background check on my social security number. The alert pinged my phone before you even walked out of that loan office. I have a copy of the finalized contract bearing my forged signature completely falsified by your hand. That is a felony, Brad. You committed identity theft and bank fraud. Bradley dropped the divorce papers onto the floor. They scattered across the broken crystal and crushed white roses. He raised his hands, clutching his own hair, as he finally understood the inescapable trap he had built for himself. He was not just facing bankruptcy and a humiliating public divorce. He was actively looking at years in a federal prison. I was desperate, Bradley whispered, his voice completely broken. I just wanted Brittany to have a beautiful night. I was going to pay it all back. I swear to you, Olivia, I was going to find a way to pay it back. I just needed a little more time to close a big deal at work. You cannot send me to prison. I am your husband. Please, I am begging you. Do not press charges. I will do anything you want. I will sign whatever you need me to sign. Just please call the loan company and tell them it was a misunderstanding. I looked down at him with absolutely zero pity. There is no misunderstanding, I stated firmly. The police already have the documentation and my corporate lawyers have already initiated the lawsuit. You are entirely out of time, out of money, and out of options. The lead police officer, who had been silently observing the entire exchange, took a deliberate step forward. The heavy thud of his boots against the marble floor echoed loudly. He raised his arm, tapping his thick fingers against the face of his heavy tactical watch. You have exactly 45 minutes left to vacate this property, sir. The officer stated, his voice devoid of any sympathy. If you are still standing here when this timer runs out, I will be placing you under arrest for criminal trespassing, and we will happily add the fraud charges to your booking sheet. I strongly suggest that you start packing up right now. Bradley dropped the heavy black garbage bag onto the polished hardwood floor. The thick plastic split open, spilling a chaotic jumble of expensive silk ties and crumpled designer shirts across the threshold. He ignored the mess entirely. His heart hammered a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs as he sprinted past the imposing police officers and shoved open the heavy oak front doors. The cool, unforgiving night air hit him instantly, but he barely felt the chill. He stumbled down the grand brick steps and practically threw himself onto the expansive circular driveway. His manicured hands went to his head, his fingers gripping his thinning hair as his eyes darted wildly across the pristine, moonlit pavement. The space where his prized possession had been parked just 2 hours ago was completely empty. His sleek, leased midnight blue luxury sports car had simply vanished. Brittany hobbled out the front door seconds later, struggling under the weight of 2 overflowing trash bags. She kicked the spilled silk ties out of her way, her heels clicking aggressively against the brick steps. She paused, dropping the bags onto the gravel driveway with a loud crunch, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She looked at Bradley, then at the empty pavement, her face contorting in fresh confusion and rising panic. "Where is the car?" Brittany demanded, her voice shrill and grating in the quiet neighborhood. "Bradley, stop staring at the ground and tell me where the valet parked our car. We need to load these bags right now. I refuse to stand out here in the freezing cold like some kind of homeless beggar." Bradley did not answer. He frantically dug his trembling hands into his tailored suit pockets, retrieving his smartphone. His fingers fumbled across the screen as he opened his messages, desperately searching for a towing notification. His bloodshot eyes locked onto a newly unread email. The sender was the high-interest lending agency he had visited just days ago. He opened the message, his jaw going completely slack as he read the automated text. The email explicitly informed him that his vehicle had been actively repossessed. The lending agency had securely installed a hidden GPS tracking device under the chassis of the car. That was standard protocol for their high-risk clients. The moment my corporate lawyers notified them that the collateral contract contained a forged signature, Bradley triggered an automatic and immediate default clause. He had committed a felony, voiding the entire agreement. The repo man had quietly rolled up the driveway, hitched his luxury ride to a silent tow truck, and dragged it away. The heavy oak front door swung open wider. I stepped out onto the grand porch, wrapping a cashmere shawl around my shoulders to block the evening chill. Kendra stood silently behind me, her arms crossed watching the pathetic display unfold. The two police officers flanked the entryway, their hands resting easily on their utility belts. "You really should read the fine print on predatory loans, Bradley," I stated, my voice projecting clearly across the circular driveway. "They do not mess around with high-risk liabilities. You tried to leverage my corporate assets to fund your pathetic vanity project, and you assumed the lenders would just take your word for it. But companies that specialize in payday loans and desperate clients do not play games. The moment my legal team informed them of your identity theft, they dispatched the repo truck. Your car belongs to them now, just like everything else in your life." Bradley stared at me, his face morphing from shock into desperate rage. He took a heavy step toward the porch, pointing a shaking finger at my face. "You called them," Bradley shouted, his voice cracking with hysteria. "You deliberately coordinated this. You stole my car. I will have you arrested for grand theft auto. I will call the police right now." The lead police officer stepped down from the porch, placing himself directly between Bradley and me. The officer casually adjusted his uniform, thoroughly unimpressed by the frantic threats. "You are not calling anyone about grand theft auto, sir," the officer commanded, his tone dripping with absolute authority. "Your vehicle was legally repossessed by a certified lending institution due to a breach of contract and a defaulted loan. That is a civil matter. What is a criminal matter, however, is your continued presence on this property. Your time is officially up. You need to gather your belongings and move off this estate right this second." Brittany let out a loud, pathetic wail. She looked down at the bulging garbage bags resting in the dirt. She could not process the reality of her situation. She had spent the entire evening sipping expensive champagne and boasting about her future wealth, and now she was standing in a driveway beside a pile of trash, completely destitute. "Call an Uber!" Brittany screamed at Bradley, kicking one of the bags. "Do not just stand there letting them humiliate us. Call a premium black car service right now. Get us out of here." Bradley frantically swiped at his phone, opening the ride-sharing application. He watched the screen load, his heart sinking further into his stomach. The app displayed a bold red warning. His linked credit card, the same account I had legally frozen hours ago, had been declined. He had absolutely zero access to any funds. He could not even afford a $5 ride to the nearest motel. He slowly lowered the phone, the crushing weight of total ruin paralyzing his limbs. He looked at Brittany, whose tear-streaked face demanded a solution he could no longer provide. Then he looked up at me, standing tall and perfectly composed on the porch. "Move along, Bradley," I said, turning my back on him. Stranded, completely carless and thoroughly evicted, they were forced to walk away into the freezing night air, dragging those heavy plastic garbage bags down the quiet, wealthy suburban street, possessing absolutely nothing but total ruin. The cold wind whipped through the towering oak trees lining the manicured street. I stood motionless on the expansive porch, the soft cashmere of my shawl providing a barrier against the freezing air. Kendra remained stationed at my side, the heavy wooden doors of my estate closed behind us. We watched the pathetic spectacle unfolding at the edge of the property. Bradley and Brittany were struggling to drag 6 overstuffed black garbage bags down the gravel driveway. The sharp stones tore at the plastic, threatening to spill their hastily packed belongings onto the ground again. Brittany was shivering violently, her thin engagement party dress offering zero protection against the harsh elements. She stumbled in her towering stiletto heels, her ankles twisting awkwardly on the uneven terrain. Bradley was panting heavily, sweat pouring down his flushed face despite the freezing temperature. The exertion of dragging the heavy bags was taking a toll on his aging body. They finally reached the end of the driveway, collapsing onto the concrete curb beneath a flickering street lamp. It was a poetic reflection of the very first day Bradley had moved into this house. Years ago, he had stood on this exact curb wearing a tailored suit, directing expensive movers as they carried his pristine boxes inside. He had acted like a conquering king claiming his rightful castle. He had looked at me with smug condescension, demanding I make space for his expansive wardrobe. Now the power dynamic was entirely reversed. The conquering king had been stripped of his stolen crown. He possessed no fake wealth, no luxury sports car, no subservient wife, and no remaining dignity. He was just a tired, broken man sitting on a dirty curb beside a pile of garbage. Brittany wrapped her arms tightly around her shivering torso, glaring up at the porch. Her perfect blowout was completely ruined by the wind, the expensive blonde extensions tangling into a messy bird nest. Her mascara had run down her cheeks, leaving dark streaks across her flawless foundation. She pointed a finger at me, her face contorting with absolute venom. "You are a monster, Olivia," Brittany screamed, her harsh voice echoing loudly through the quiet neighborhood. "You are a cold, heartless monster, and you are going to burn for what you did to us tonight." I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or offer a defensive rebuttal. I simply smiled, a slow, serene expression of absolute victory. I reached over to the small patio table beside me, picking up a crystal flute of leftover vintage champagne from the ruined engagement party. I raised the glass toward the street in a silent toast and took a slow, deliberate sip. The expensive bubbles tasted incredibly sweet. Brittany let out an incoherent shriek of pure frustration, kicking the curb before collapsing onto one of the garbage bags, burying her face in her hands and sobbing loudly. Bradley slowly turned his head to look back at the estate. He stared at the massive brick facade, the glowing windows, and the landscaped gardens he had so desperately claimed as his own. His eyes traveled up the grand staircase to the master bedroom suite he would never enter again. I could see the exact moment his ego finally shattered into dust. The realization washed over his exhausted face, transforming his arrogant scowl into a mask of hollow despair. He finally understood the catastrophic magnitude of his mistakes. He had gambled his entire existence on a pathetic illusion of superiority, and he had lost everything. He looked at me standing gracefully on the porch, bathed in the warm light of the home I owned, the home I had protected. I held his gaze, refusing to look away, forcing him to witness the unshakable strength he had foolishly tried to destroy. He blinked first, dropping his head in total defeat. A pair of dim, misaligned headlights suddenly appeared at the far end of the street. A beat-up economy sedan slowly rattled down the road, its engine coughing and sputtering loudly in the quiet night. The vehicle lurched to a halt directly in front of Bradley and Brittany. The faded Uber sticker in the cracked windshield illuminated the driver, a tired-looking man who clearly had no intention of getting out to help. The contrast between this decaying compact car and the sleek luxury vehicle Bradley had lost just moments ago was staggering. Bradley practically dragged himself off the curb. He grabbed the first two garbage bags and lugged them toward the back of the car. He popped the trunk, revealing a space far too small to accommodate their belongings. Panic set back in as he desperately tried to shove the oversized bags into the cramped compartment. Plastic ripped, fabric spilled out. He punched the bags, his face red with exertion and humiliation, frantically trying to compress the contents. Brittany stood shivering on the sidewalk, offering no assistance, complaining loudly about the foul smell emanating from the vehicle's exhaust pipe. It took him 5 agonizing minutes of pushing, shoving, and cursing to force the trunk lid closed. He tied the remaining bags together, tossing them aggressively into the cramped back seat before pushing a whining Brittany into the car. Bradley paused for one final second, his hand resting on the rusty door handle. He looked back at the house, his shoulders completely slumped. He did not say a single word. He pulled the door shut, the metal grinding loudly. The engine revved, emitting a thick cloud of dark gray exhaust smoke. The beat-up economy car slowly pulled away from the curb, its faint red taillights fading steadily into the vast, dark distance. I stood on the porch, watching, until the vehicle completely disappeared around the bend, leaving the quiet suburban street utterly silent and peaceful once again. I took one final sip of my champagne, letting the cool autumn wind brush against my face. I turned to Kendra, a genuine smile touching my lips. Well, that was productive. The next morning, the sprawling estate was bathed in brilliant golden sunlight. For the first time in 3 years, the house was blissfully silent. There were no heavy, arrogant footsteps pacing across the upstairs hallway. There was no shrill, demanding voice echoing from the kitchen, complaining about the imported spring water. The oppressive weight of the toxic presence of Bradley and Brittany had been entirely lifted, leaving behind a profound and rejuvenating peace. I walked slowly through the grand foyer, my bare feet gliding silently across the pristine marble floor. The shattered crystal and bruised white roses from the hysterical temper tantrum of Brittany were gone, swept away in the early hours. I breathed in the fresh, clean air circulating through the open French doors. The house finally felt like mine again. It felt entirely cleansed. At precisely 8 in the morning, 6 professional cleaners arrived in a white van. I met the supervisor at the front door with a very specific set of instructions and a substantial cash bonus. I directed them straight up the grand staircase to the master suite. I ordered them to strip the massive California king bed down to the wooden frame. The expensive silk sheets, the plush-down comforter, and the heavy mattress were all hauled out the back door and thrown directly into a rented industrial dumpster. I instructed the crew to scrub every single inch of the master bathroom with industrial bleach. I wanted the marble countertops, the walk-in shower, and the soaking tub sanitized until they gleamed. I needed every lingering trace of expensive cologne from Bradley and overpowering floral perfume from Brittany eradicated from the premises. I watched with deep satisfaction as the crew methodically erased the final remnants of their miserable existence from my property. Leaving the cleaning crew to their work, I made my way down the East Wing corridor toward my expansive home office. The room was a sanctuary of productivity, lined with floor-to-ceiling mahogany bookshelves and dominated by a massive custom drafting table. I walked over to the built-in espresso machine, breathing in the rich aroma of dark coffee beans as the dark liquid filled my favorite ceramic mug. Carrying the steaming cup to the drafting table, I unrolled a fresh set of thick, detailed architectural blueprints. This was my next multi-million-dollar real estate development project. A sleek commercial complex planned for the downtown financial district. Bradley had spent years mocking my corporate ambitions, arrogantly believing my work was nothing more than a cute little hobby to pass the time. He never comprehended the sheer scale of the empire I was quietly building right under his nose. I traced the sharp lines of the blueprints with my index finger, feeling a surge of unadulterated power. I was not just a landlord or a betrayed wife. I was a titan in my industry, and my next major conquest was already fully underway. The sharp ringing of my smartphone broke the quiet concentration. The screen illuminated with the name of Kendra. I swiped to answer, placing the phone on speaker as I took another sip of my hot coffee. "Good morning, Kendra," I greeted, my voice echoing slightly in the large office. "Good morning, Olivia," Kendra replied, her tone brisk and satisfied. "I thought you would appreciate a brief update on our newly evicted former tenants." I leaned against the heavy oak drafting table, a genuine smile spreading across my face. "I am listening." Bradley spent the entire night sitting in a holding cell, Kendra stated. The high-interest loan agency did not just repossess his luxury car. They officially pressed criminal charges for the forged signature on the collateral documents. The federal prosecutor is extremely motivated. Bradley is currently facing multiple counts of bank fraud and identity theft. He is looking at a minimum of 5 to 10 years in a penitentiary. He has absolutely no assets left to hire a decent defense attorney. He has ruined his entire life. "And what about his remarkably charming daughter?" I slowly asked, swirling the dark coffee in my mug. Kendra let out a sharp, genuine, incredibly amused laugh. "Brittany had a harsh collision with reality this morning. Without your limitless credit cards to fund her lavish lifestyle, and with her father sitting in jail, she found herself entirely destitute. She spent the night in a filthy $40 motel right off the interstate. I received confirmation an hour ago that she just applied for a job at a greasy 24-hour fast food diner down the street from the motel. She was hired on the spot. The girl who demanded imported white roses and vintage champagne for her fake engagement party is currently wearing a polyester uniform and flipping cheap burgers just to pay for her motel room. She has been stripped of every single delusion of grandeur." I ended the call with Kendra feeling a deep, resonating sense of absolute closure. I picked up my coffee mug and walked slowly toward the massive bay window at the far end of my office. The thick, clear glass offered a sweeping, unobstructed view of the perfectly manicured back lawns, the sparkling deep blue swimming pool, and the towering ancient oak trees guarding the very edge of my sprawling estate. The entire property was completely beautiful, incredibly secure, and most importantly, it was entirely mine owned, free and clear. I took a long, steady breath, feeling the warm, brilliant morning sunlight wash directly over my face. I vividly thought about the sheer, unmitigated audacity of Bradley proudly handing me that ridiculous, condescending chore list just yesterday, aggressively demanding I clean the baseboards of my own mansion for his daughter and her party. The next time someone hands you a chore list in your own house, do not ever get angry. Just simply smile, say, okay, and remember the eviction notice you hand them at the very end will be genuinely worth every single second.
I used to ride upon your shoulders, thinking you could touch the sky. Every road felt less uncertain when I saw the world through your eyes. You were stronger than the mountains, taller than the northern pines. And when the winter winds were coming, you would stand between them and I. Time kept moving like the river, years slipped slowly out to sea. But no matter where life took me, you were always part of me. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. You taught me strength is not in power, but in kindness when it's hard. You taught me how to keep on going when the road grows cold and dark. Every lesson, every story, every laugh around the flame lies within me like an echo, calling softly through my name. And when I face my greatest battles, when I feel I can't go on, I can hear your voice beside me saying, child, you're stronger than you know. I am my father's daughter, in every step I take, in every time I choose to stand. When it's easier to break, I carry your courage in my heart, your fire inside my soul. And though the years keep moving on, your love still leads me home. One day the snow will cover footprints, one day the fire will burn low. But the things a father gives his daughter are the things that never go. Not the gold or not the stories, not the battles that he won, but the quiet way he loved her and the woman she becomes. I am my father's daughter, and I always will remain through triumph, every loss, through every joy, and every pain. The world may change around me, the stars may fade above, but I will always carry with me my Father's endless love. And when they ask me who I am, I'll smile and answer softly, I am